Today's live show is sponsored by Uffizzi. Stand up your developer platform in minutes with Uffizzi. The Uffizzi platform provides fast provision Kubernetes clusters for all your dev and testing needs. Every engineer gets self-service, sandboxed virtual clusters. Every team can have centralized management of those clusters. It runs on their infrastructure or yours. Uffizzi has deployment support for Helm, Kustomize, Kubernetes Manifest, and even Docker Compose. Their management platform has features such as sleep mode, time-based deletion, and resource quotas for avoiding overspending. Try their free starter tier today by spinning up your first sandbox cluster in under a minute at uffizzi.com. Welcome to the show. I am Bret.
I'm Nirmal.
Hi,
Nirmal. How are you, Bret? How are you doing today?
Good.
Good.
We're live as usual on Thursdays. We're so hardcore here that Nirmal and I We're live from DockerCon last week because we couldn't take a break for a week. We had
to do it. We were there. We were in the action. We had to do a live show.
Yes. So we're back again. Technically, this is the Cloud Native Q&A episode of the month, and people can just ask anything they want about Cloud Native. We don't normally cover news. Like, you and I are not journalists. No. And we don't play them on TV.
But that being said, we're going to cover some of the announcements from DockerCon 2023 on today's Q&A show.
Yeah, I figured it was, I don't know, we've had a week, right? We've kind of figured out some things. We understand a little bit better. We've skimmed the press releases and tried to suck out what do engineers care about? Like, we don't care about press releases, venture beat, blah, 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 announcement thingies. Like, we care about what are you changing in my tools? What tools am I getting that I didn't have before?
And like, what are the topics du jour? What was everyone talking about? What were some of the themes that we got from DockerCon 2023? Things like, what was relevant to the community that's you out there in the internet.
Yeah, there was 2 days of keynotes. Dan's asking, did we pick up any swag? I don't know about you, but my swag game was weak last week.
I wish I could pick up my laptop right now. I got a exclusive Olama sticker. And I
didn't get a hookup from Matt.
And we'll talk a little bit about Olama like a little bit later in the show today. But that was my favorite piece of swag. On top of, we were just talking about this right before the show started. As Docker captains, we got a new updated Docker Moby plushie, which I think is, that's awesome. But we both have to figure out where we're gonna fit, the plushie somewhere around her.
Oh, and well, technically I have one here.
Yeah.
Because I was lucky enough during the pandemic for them to send me one because I got friends. But now we all have one, which is great because I didn't, I don't necessarily need exclusive swag. Like, all the captains should get the swag. And then we got a Moby Lego.
Yeah, I have not built mine yet.
Neither have I. Beth wanted me to do like a stop photography, like stop motion build of it.
Nice.
I'm not one of those unboxers, so I'm not prepared for this level of.
Maybe we can do that on a show. We can live build it while we're answering questions or something.
Riveting content. Well, how would that work on the podcast? Would we like ASMR the pieces together? Click.
The podcast. How do we do it for the podcast?
Yes, the white goes on the blue piece to make the base.
We're going way off the rails so quick on this show today. Let's go back to DockerCon 2023. So, first of all, before we do that, where can folks join our community and talk to other like-minded folks?
So you have links above you. I see a question, by the way, about DevOps engineer. We'll get to that question. But we're all in a couple of places. One, you can come join us for the podcast, which is whenever we have guests, and sometimes when we don't have guests, we do a podcast form, the audio edited down version. So you don't get all this chit chat. You get just the juice. And that is over here at podcast.bretfisher.com. Yeah. And then what's the next link? The next link would be the newsletter. The newsletter is key, people. If you want to hang out with us, the newsletter is key. It tells you what we're going to do on each live stream. It tells you who was on the podcast or who's about to be on the podcast. It keeps you up to date every week on the going-ons around this little community. And then we have a Discord server. So just go to devops.fan. That's right above us. That is this server. And I think we just recently crossed 16,000 people. and we're talking all about cloud native DevOps. So if you have DevOps questions that you don't get answered here, or if you'd like other people's opinions, because we're just two people with opinions, you can join us on Discord.
Not just.
We're two people with opinions that are a little bit informed, maybe a little bit.
I think so. Just a little bit. Speaking of the newsletter, a lot of the topics we're going to be talking today about with respect to DockerCon last week are covered in the latest newsletter release, I guess, mailing. What's it
CNDO,
called?
Cloud Native DevOps 34, because I have to have acronyms for everything. So I just put that link in chat. CNDO.
CNDO. I like it. So if you want more information about what we're talking about, what we're recapping, links to other blog posts, repos for software, Docker blog announcements, all the links are there. Oh, yeah, it's by the way, video in a YouTube video.
This is us last week.
Yeah, there we go.
It was real. We were IRL at DockerCon last week. In case you missed it, we had bandwidth. We did a live stream that didn't suck in terms of technical issues. It did work.
It did work.
It's always nice after you're spending an hour doing it and half an hour setting up that you go back to YouTube, and yes, indeed, it did get streamed to the internet.
Yeah. And we had some other Docker captains on there show up and talk about some of the things they liked at the show, and check it out. But if you want another recap, shall we get into what happened last week?
Yeah, let's do it. So we're now in DockerCon announcements mode. Okay.
There we go.
So if we're going in, we're just going to talk about the things that I talk about in the newsletter, and we're going to expand on that. So let me go find that newsletter that I just had up.
So DockerCon was 2 days in Los Angeles at I think it was called the Magic Box. A bunch of the Docker captains were there from around the world, which was great. Both Bret and I got a chance to see a lot of folks we haven't seen since, 2019. Yep. The last DockerCon that was in person. Feels like ages ago, but it was great to meet up with a lot of folks and kind of get highlights of the last few years from all their careers, what they're doing. And then on top of that, there's a bunch of new Docker captains that have recently joined, and it was great to get to know them and see what awesome activities they're working on. And then each day started with a keynote. And so the first day at DockerCon was a keynote around
Scout.
There we go.
Docker Scout Con.
There we go.
And Scout is hard to talk about because it's got so much under the umbrella. It's kind of like what Docker Desktop is now. Like Docker Desktop could have its own website, right? DockerDesktop.com. I don't know if that's a domain. You probably shouldn't go buy it. Docker will probably take it back from you. But yeah, there's so many features on Docker Desktop, and now Scout is this. It's like anything that's security related seems to start getting thrown under the Scout. So when you think of Scout, think of security. Step one. That's what that Docker wants you to do. It includes hub features, Docker desktop features, additional command lines, the GUI, local and remote, team-based features, and even a Docker GitHub action for Scout that will help you with your PRs. And it's largely around vulnerabilities and focusing on discovering vulnerabilities, but you can't. It's hard to say that it's just a scanner because it's not just a CVE scanner. It's like it takes it a couple of steps further, where it first creates the SBOM and it scans the SBOM. That's a little bit different than some of the other tools where it actually can create the SBOM. I don't know if it's still using Gripe on the inside. It used to be.
It's like a comprehensive suite of features to visualize, communicate, and make actionable security, vulnerability, data that is part of your software supply chain, aka your Docker containers that you're building and publishing and running
Yeah.
in some kind of fashion.
And one of the
um,
things that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, not ironically, but super relevant. It was the same week. I don't know if you saw this, but there was a there was a vulnerability in curl, um, announced or released, like patches for curl and libcurl, and so these kind of tools are super relevant for when big vulnerabilities like the curl one that came out this past week get announced. So kind of really not great timing in terms of like, hey, there's a big vulnerability everyone needs to patch, but something like Docker Scout can be used to understand whether you have like libcurl running in your container or in your dependencies, and whether you need to fix that or not.
Yeah. Um, the scanner, it starts off with the scan. I think most people that get started with Scout will probably just try to run the scanner. And
Right.
the command line is Docker Scout. Or you can see it in Docker Desktop. Or you can see it at scout.docker.com, which is what you're seeing on my screen right now. And that discovers vulnerabilities like other scanners. I did a talk at DockerCon where I compared the results of scanners briefly of 4 different popular scanners. And I'll be honest, out of the gate, 1.0, Scout is doing pretty great. Like I worked with the team on several issues, or what I thought were issues, like why is this vulnerability not listed? Why is this one listed? And should it be? Why is this image showing 0, 0, 0, 0 vulnerabilities? Like I kept working back and forth with the team. Luckily, as the captains, we have insider access because I wanted to understand what it was doing. And it's pretty smart. They just in the working with them over the last, I don't know, 6 months, they've definitely taken direct feedback and have fixed things very quickly within days of
Yeah.
me saying like this image doesn't work right with the scan. This particular vulnerability is listed with other scanners, but not yours. Why is that? And then it would explain that, oh, it shouldn't be listed. And those are actually other ones are scanning false positives. So there's the deeper you get into the CVE vulnerability scanning game, the more you realize there's nuance, there's opinion. There's a lot of a lack of perfection, I guess, in the results. So you really have to, if you really want to know exactly what your vulnerabilities are, you have to spend an untold amount of time. One of the things that Scout does that others don't tend to do is it will give you recommendations for what to do next. One of those big recommendations is once it's scanned your image, it will make recommendations on a base image update. So one of the things it'll help you do is my base image out of date? And if it is, what is the CVE count different? And
Mhm.
this is like official images, but not just official images. It will do it on other images that aren't even official, as long as they're on Hub and it can go get them. Um, it may not know the update path of that particular image. So if you make your own custom base, but if your custom base comes from an official base, like if you work your way back, it may know. So there is some magic there that may not work if you literally went from scratch, which I don't know anybody that does that. Like, I mean, if you have Scratch, you don't have dependencies. You do something like Golang or Rust or something. But
Yeah.
if you have a Ubuntu or an official Debian or something that's your base, it will make base image recommendations. It will also do things like say, hey, maybe you should use a Slim, or you should maybe use an Alpine version variant. And and it will even show you if you did that, this is what it would look like.
Yeah.
The Docker desktop GUI does this as well, but it will do it in a slightly different way. And you have to click a button, a little Scout button. It'll pop up
Mm.
this whole new interface that will help you understand not just the numbers, but what is going on in your image and what are the quickest actions you can take for the biggest difference, rather than going through every manual CVE
Yeah.
uh,
And
disclosure. And
that's a key. I don't want to just go over that detail very fast, but that's a key part, which is uh, working on making this information actionable, because around security tooling, there can be a lot of noise, right? And alert fatigue, if you will. And showing recommendations that are actionable, uh, for the developer or whoever's responsible for those images is one of the focuses of the Docker Scout tool, and focus of the announcements as well. Uh, that's kind of a key part of that, to make sure that you're not just, if you have like some kind of tool that's just showing tons of vulnerabilities, but you don't know like what matters, then it's very hard to take any kind of action, right? Like you can spin on something that might not move the needle much at all.
Yeah, and there's the other half of this. Well, there's more than two halves. There's like four halves. One other major part of this, we're not going to go through all these today because I think it deserves its own episode. But under, let's see, I don't think it's under policies. I gotta find it. I found it. Nope. These are, by the way, these are all my images that it's scanning and focusing on the vulnerabilities.
Looks like you got some work cut out for you.
I do. It goes to base images, and I don't understand why this is only showing this one. I think it's, I don't understand that one yet. I'm hoping to find, okay, this one's interesting because it's actually showing all the dependency packages inside my images. So it gives you all these different views. And there's a few other commercial tools like this.
Why don't you, in the packages one, why don't you look up curl real quick?
And see if my curl.
Yeah. There you go. So you've got some curls to update.
Yeah, but the problem is this is it. Like you can't click on it.
Yeah.
I mean, do I need to update it? I don't know. Like it's not showing me any of that. So I've looked at this interface before and I'm like, okay, neat, but not useful. The thing I'm looking for, and I just don't be able to, maybe it's under settings. Maybe it's under, integrations. There we go. So the other interesting thing here is that,
that's right.
Yeah, it's not just a scanner for the image repository. It is potentially a scanner that you can plug into other places where you're either processing, using images, making images, and there's a lot here. And so they organize it to registries, CI tools where you can use this. So when I talk about, there's a GitHub action for Scout. We talked about last week that at minimum, what that integration does is it compares the vulnerabilities in the image in that pull request and compare it to the image vulnerabilities of the branch you're merging into, so that you can understand if your PR is increasing the number of vulnerabilities or reducing the number of vulnerabilities. That's one thing. And it supports a lot of them, all the major ones really. And then environment monitoring, which I don't quite understand this yet, but it's got sysdig in there. So we're maybe talking about possibly production. It says for your running containers. This is something that you and I were talking about last week. We have to figure out more about this, but that's another component of it is, and when you're talking about vulnerability management, you're really talking about what just in my images, because I may not be using those images, but what's actually running in production. I think that's a potential player right there.
Yep.
Focusing on your source code. So this is common of other tools in the industry that aren't just focused on container images, but also the source code and its dependencies in your repos. So they got that. And then IDEs. So interesting. It's interesting that there's a VS Code one. These don't exist yet. So you can upvote and say, yes, get me VS Code. How would it help me? So you too can be influenced by all of this. And all you have to do is, if you just have a Docker account, by the way, I don't think to get to this, you need to pay anything. I'm not paying for Docker Scout. Clearly, it's telling me I have account limits. So everyone gets 3 free repos to be scanned and managed by Docker Scout. So scout.docker.com. And then there's this integration page, and you can start plugging it in and playing with it. So it's pretty neat that this is general availability, which means all of you watching, you can all go play with this. You can get started. You don't need us to like give you a play-by-play. You could just do it yourself.
Yep. So that's Docker Scout.
Docker Scout.
The other theme from DockerCon, at least the first day keynotes, was the software development lifecycle before your pull request, sometimes called the inner loop. That was mentioned a few times in some of the announcements, and that's the idea of reducing the friction of that inner loop. So all the development, the programming you'll be doing before you make a pull request, right? So this is kind of before you're deploying to maybe a dev or test or production environment. You're just coding, right? You're trying to figure out how to solve whatever that business problem that you're solving, and introducing tooling to help with reducing the friction of that inner loop. The first one they kind of showed off is Docker having now the ability to do cloud builds. And do you want to go over that, Bret?
Yeah, cloud builds. It's one of those features where we wonder why didn't we have this 8 years ago? It's not necessarily related to Docker Cloud, or sorry, Docker Hub. If anyone's out there has been around long enough, they remember Docker Cloud. This is not Docker Cloud because it's not about production. It's simply allowing anyone with, I don't know if this is a separate subscription. I don't know how they're going to structure the finances of this, but you simply create a new builder locally. It's like 2 commands. And if you didn't know this, with BuildX on your machine, BuildX is the utility that enables advanced build kit functionality. Build kit is the new way we build images. If you've used Docker Build at all in the last year, they've switched over to Build Kit by default. It's fancy. It's got blue colors. It's got all this stuff going on. One of those things that's always been a feature is you can create multiple builders, and those builders can have various features. They can be on a different platform. They can use QEMU. They can be remote. They can be somewhere else. And we've had that for a while. And now what you can do is there's a new driver in there called Cloud Driver. And so you can do something like Docker buildx create -- driver cloud or something like that. I think it's something close to the command. But you can also do this now in the GUI, because the Docker Desktop GUI earlier this year, thanks to Crazy Max and some of the team at Docker, they built a UI to manage your builders. And up until now, this is really a feature for really advanced users, because most people just use the default builder. They didn't even know they could have multiple builders, or why they would. Yeah. Because all those features are kind of hidden behind command line flags, and it wasn't obvious how you would set this up and have a build farm and all that. We all have CIs already, so we kind of just use that. Well, this allows you to now either on your machine or even from your CI, which may only be a single platform like GitHub Actions, which is only on AMD 64 and does not have ARM64 support. So I can use Docker build, or they're calling it, Hydro build was the code word. I still think they should call it Hydro build. They're calling it next gen Docker build. I'm seeing how they don't want to call it Docker Cloud, because that's already a thing that they've had and then they got rid of, and they don't want to confuse it. So naming is hard. But essentially what this is a remote builder that can be ARM native and AMD native, and the caching can be shared throughout your organization. So your builds help other people's builds with the build cache. It's not just a local build cache or a build cache in your CI. If you change your CI to use these same remote builders that you could use on your local machine remotely, then everything will be gaining from that centralized caching, instead of a cache in CI and a cache on Joe's machine and cache on Wendy's machine. And at the same time, you can get multi-architecture builds out of the box. And it's transparent. So if you want
to change the command. Yeah.
Right. It's like one command to change your builder locally, or you can make it the default and it always builds in the remote builder. And then you can just keep using your Docker build commands all day long, but you don't realize that in the background, it's technically zipping up your directory in a tarball, copying it to the cloud, building it on a server in the cloud, and then sending the results back to your machine in the
Yep.
form of image layers. So that was technically all possible before. You would have had to just set up all those machines, and there wasn't a shared cache, and you would have a bunch of servers to manage, and plus, connections over the internet are challenging, and the Docker engine is not exactly in the build kit daemon. They're all like, there's a lot of management there, and this is going to take care of that. This is like a one-liner addition, I think. And honestly, I think that eventually, for people paying for a Docker subscription, assuming this is somehow part of that, this is just going to, like, you're just going to do this. Like, this is going to be how you use your CI. This is how you're going to build images in your team. Because why, unless you have a security requirement that prevents you from using Docker's cloud, I can't help but saying it. If you can't, unless you have a security requirement that prevents you from doing that, this seems like a no-brainer for everyone. Because I love and always try to build multi-platform images. Like,
Yeah.
I just want every image.
There's a lot of cost. Yeah, there's a lot of advantages to like multi-arch, cost, performance, benefits. Mac M series laptops have kind of pushed a lot of us to thinking about ARM as like the main architecture that we're building on. I think this. I'm excited to see where this will go once it's out there, and what additional improvements can be made to squeeze out more performance over time, and make it, reduce that friction on that inner loop.
Yeah.
Conrad, what your quote?
Docker Cloud is back. Yeah, I think this is kind of a wait and see. I don't see any scenario where this is slower than local builds unless you're on pretty poor internet and you're copying in a giant amount of data or files into the image from your local machine. Because if you do this remotely, there is that additional step of it has to tarball up everything in your local machine and then send it over to the builder. And for those of you that are maybe not Docker build experts, and that's okay. It just works. So a lot of times you don't have to be an expert. That little dot you put at the end, typically, that is your context. And then what happens in the background is the Docker command line looks at that location. It's usually the current directory, takes everything in the subdirectories, everything that's not in the Docker ignore file. It tarballs all that up. It doesn't gzip it by default, but it can with an option. There's an option there to gzip it. And then it will send it to Docker. Now, on Docker desktop, that's technically not on your machine. That's in a VM. So it's technically still copying it over the Docker socket. And but that all happens transparently. Like, hard drives are fast locally. We got SSDs. The minute we go over the internet, that's when you're going to start noticing various nuances of, it's faster to build, but there's this extra step that might take a little longer. Yep. The cool thing is, in their documentation, they already have a lot of this spelled out. They already explain, like, try to do this. If you're going to use cloud builds as your default builder, like, you might want to strategize on your Docker build, your Docker file rather, and focus it on things like using the add to pull in remote assets. By the way, the add command now supports Git repos. This is like a brand new feature. They don't talk about this stuff because it's low-level build kit stuff. But with the latest front end, and I haven't even talked about it in the newsletter, you can put in an add. If you just want to pull down a repo into your Docker image, you can just do an add and the Git URL on GitHub, and it will just pull it down. You don't have to use apt install git and then run git clone. Like, if you think of all the things you have to do just to get a Git repo, you don't have to do that anymore.
And that's like the whole entire history of whatever that thing is too. So
yeah, the add versus copy, that whole thing, you mean?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, we could talk about that for a while, but we have a couple of questions. You want to hit the questions real quick?
Sure. I think we've been answering while we're talking as well. I think the first one was, I have a question. I am a DevOps engineer, but what things should make out for better job in cloud and DevOps role? And this is from Abzal. I'm assuming that's how you say that name. So that's a broad topic. Right now, with respect to DevOps and the DevOps role in cloud. Uh, Straight up, pick a cloud provider, learn that cloud provider's tooling, learn containers. You're in the right place for that. And I would put out there Kubernetes as a environment that containers are deployed to in production. There's some great courses from someone we might know around those topics. And then from there, uh, if I were to start today, honestly, I would learn how to use tooling like Code Whisperer, um, ChatGPT, LLMs, how those tools can enhance the workflow of development and the files necessary for infrastructure as code for deployments, and use it as a essentially like a tutoring tool, like a virtual tutor, maybe to dive into the details of different patterns and tooling that we have in the DevOps industry currently. Over to you, Bret. Anything to add?
No, I put a link in there in case they want more information. I have a whole. If you're talking about your DevOps path, like your learning path, your career path,
Yep.
There's a link, gives you a lot more info. Good question. Dan had a question that you were answering on Docker files and how to execute things. I think you're right. The entry point, not the build, is the way you want to go for volumes. There might be a use case, but it's going to be it's going to be a very, very rare use case where I would agree that that's the right strategy during a build. I was actually trying to remember. I know the new build front ends allow you to bind mount now during the build, but I didn't know if it would support volumes. It's possible.
Yeah,
I just don't know that I've ever seen
that
it.
doesn't seem like the right kind of pattern. If you need to do something at runtime, one off to kind of bootstrap your application or do some one-time configuration, write a script that's checking for a lock file, execute your one-time statements that you need to do, your shell script, write your lock file if it's successful, and that's a way to do like a one-shot shell script, and make that your entry point for your container. That's a very common pattern. You can take a look at a lot of the base images for a ton of software out there, and you'll see that the entry point is the way that they're doing that kind of one-shot build or one-shot like script.
Yeah. I think you get in trouble when you start changing things elsewhere during a build. A build is absolutely just like, and this reminds me of the scenario where I just had someone recently who was making images for different environments. They were building different images for different environments, which is also an anti-pattern. You want a generic image, and that image by design needs to be an artifact. It needs to be a thing that is not changing over time. And the more you start doing things like, thinking about environment-based builds, or I want to change things outside of the container when I build it, those all create they create this, even though it's possible, you're going to probably have side effects, and you're going to create a weird setup. You're going to be forced to create a weird setup that's not like everyone else's. So one of the things we try to do, especially because we both have consulting backgrounds, is that one of the advantages of using these tools in the way that they're recommended, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And if you use the tools, and there's usually a way with Docker because there's so many flags, there's so many features. It's usually a way of just talking to enough experts to figure out how to do it in a way that's still following best practices. Because what you don't want is a unicorn. You're not special, right? Like the special needs you have are a million other people have that same need. There's not really anyone with a special need. We all think we're unique, but we're not actually in this world of software. So if you had that need, I bet you there's a lot of other people that have that need, and they're able to solve it using best practices. That way, when you hire new people or your team changes people, you don't have this incredibly unique setup that no one understands how it works because it's so different from the way everyone else does it. That's one of the things that I'm always trying to help people avoid, because you don't want to have to onboard someone and then they're going, why are you doing it like this? I've never seen this before, right?
Yeah.
You try to avoid that because that just creates friction. You really kind of want to follow the best practices. By the way, I pulled up ad just because like the ad and the copy Dan was asking about, I wants to add S3 bucket files, and I was like, can that happen? That might be able to happen.
Directly from, are you trying to add files directly from an S3 bucket?
That's what I was asking. I haven't got an answer
or
back.
Are you trying to create an S3 bucket when the container runs?
Either
way,
I was assuming.
I mean, you can always have AWS CLI tools in your container, in your. Okay, so if you're copying files from an S3 bucket, you can. I don't know if can you do the add from directly from a so.
You can add from a URL.
Yes, you can add from a URL, but that presupposes that you have that exposed, like
right
at some point.
So,
which is maybe not what you want to do. Another way to do that would be to have a script using the AWS CLI, pull that file in as a one-time script and then in your shell script have a lock file or check for the existence of something that would exist if that command is run successfully and would not exist if that command ran unsuccessfully, and that make that script your entry point. Now, with respect to your credentials, use Docker secrets or whatever the secrets tooling that you have for wherever you're running that container. If you're not running on a container orchestration, then and if you're running on an EC2 instance, then use the IAM role that's part of that EC2 instance, and as a last resort, have those credentials as environment variables. But ideally, you have them in some kind of secrets management tool or something a little bit more secure.
Docker.
I will repeat, do not put your AWS credentials into your Docker container or into your Git repo. Please.
The ad is pretty much the thing you're going to want to use when you can use it. It doesn't have an S3 or AWS specific feature. So if you think about the add command, there's lots and lots. I mean, when you look at underneath it, there's lots of different ways you can do it. You can do private Git, you can do GitHub, you can do regular files, you can do local files, you can do all these things. You can automatically untar things. But when you're talking about something with unique authentication like S3, if it can't simply be a URL authentication system for something on the web that's HTTP, and you need some sort of other additional CLI to first authenticate you, you're going to have to do all this in Run. So the trick is with Run, and you're going to have to install the AWS CLI, and you're going to have to do that, and you have to add secrets. This is all in here. Like, you can use secrets with the builder. You can do it a safe way. Let's see if it talks about. It is not recommended to use build time variables for passing secrets like GitHub keys, user credentials. Refer to run mount type secret section to learn more about securing ways to use secrets. So you're going to want to look at that. If you don't know about that, you probably already do. So that's how you get the secrets in for the AWS CLI. Now, the other thing too is and I've seen this before. I've seen this where teams want to bring in. They're using S3 as an artifact store, which is pretty much what it's meant for. And they are pulling in files that are built elsewhere and then stored in S3 buckets. If those are only in S3 for the purposes of being pulled down into an image build, like if there's no other distribution system for that S3 bucket, if it's just there so you can build from it, then my recommendation is you use some of the new volume stuff and you build those files into an image and then you copy from the image and used a registry as the artifact store for the things that are in your S3 bucket. If I don't know the architecture of your S3 and we don't have time to get into it, but S3 as an artifact store, if it's just for containers, then I say move all that out of S3 and move it into an image. That's, I mean, you just saw me, if you go to the newsletter over there, there's over at bretfisher.com, there's 3 weeks of newsletters I just wrote last month about the future of the image repository or Docker Hub as an artifact store for all these types of artifacts, volumes, plugins, images, like actual graphic images, like any type of artifact you can imagine can be now stored in a registry. So not that I'm saying S3 is wrong. It's just, it might be simpler if your end goal is really, we put things in S3 and then they're consumed by Docker builds or other container-like things. It might make sense for you to just move off of S3 for that particular artifact.
Yeah.
Just an idea. Yeah.
If it's dependencies that your application, great question. If it's and that's the word artifact there carries a lot of weight. Assuming it's a dependency for your application, that's a build time. Thing that you should put in your container. If it's something like specific configuration file that's updated somewhere, or something else that needs to be pulled in at runtime to change the behavior of your application, and is environment dependent, then putting some kind of script and entry point is another way to do that.
I've watched entire teams, by the way, build tools in Docker where it's a web server, and the web server is going to be run on-prem, and it's designed to have a bunch of files like actual installs, like mac.apps or windows.exes or MSIs for Windows, right? And they don't necessarily want to store those permanently in the web server image or rebuild the web server that's serving them every time one of those files changes, right? So they separate out the artifacts. And they originally were using something like S3, essentially JFrog, Artifactory, to store those. And we changed their workflow so that it was all stored in images. So whenever those things were built, and and Jenkins or whatever, I wouldn't necessarily call them legacy, but the way those things are packaged up, when they're copied up, instead of the old school way of like copying them up to FTP or maybe S3 or something like that, they simply just do a Docker build with a single file that just wraps it in an image. It gives it a unique tag of like the date, so we know, or the Simver or whatever that MSI package or the Mac.app or whatever. And then it stores those in images in the image registry so that the web server, when it boots, during an entry point, like you mentioned, dynamically downloads those files on start. And they had a very simple setup, but their way of, we need the latest images for this web server, is to just restart the container.
Yeah.
It wasn't the best. It wasn't ideal because we wanted something that we didn't really have a unique artifact, but we couldn't. They had very little money, very few people like to do this. They needed a very quick solution. They didn't have a web UI that said refresh images. They didn't have any of that stuff. So they were just like, well, we don't want to store. It was like 10 gig of stuff. And they were like, well, we don't want to store the web server with 10 gig of stuff every time.
Yeah, so, and I think we're going to see more questions around this, or especially as folks are starting to train models, machine learning models, use existing machine learning models. I know we have a long list of other things. We're definitely not going to get through the rest of the list today from the DockerCon announcement. So tune in to subsequent live shows for us to cover the rest of the topics that were covered at DockerCon 2023. But with respect to these artifacts, this is becoming, there's more questions around this, especially now as people are trying to use like open source large language models that exist and pulling them into their Docker containers for inference, for example, or running them locally. So the idea of storing artifacts that your application depends on in images or in other ways and pulling them in dynamically is these are patterns that we're going to continue to evolve and continue to see more around. We have some more questions. Do you want to try to tackle them
Yeah, I'm going
before
to
the
see
end
if
of
I
the
can
hour?
do but I do want to get back to the Docker announcements.
Okay.
But I don't want to ignore people. So I'm going to do rapid fire because I think I got some quick answers. Bold,
Okay.
bold dish. The difference between Docker Cloud Build and Kaneko, I'm not even sure how to say that, is Kaneko, is that Kaneko, I'm going to say Kaneko. Kaneko, it just simply builds your images in a Kubernetes cluster. It doesn't necessarily build a different image than what you would build with Docker build or Docker. It's not like KO or any of these very custom builders.
Mm-hmm.
Surprisingly, almost all these builders or things are all using BuildKit in the background. So they're all technically using the same engine to build your images. The only difference here is that this is a part of a Docker subscription service. Like, I'm pretty sure that Docker is not going to provide free builds for everyone for free. So we don't know pricing, we don't know availability. Like, this is very, very early days for this Hydro build thing. I really just want them to call it Docker Hydro build. But if I keep saying it, maybe they'll make it that happen. But I don't see them as similar because most of the teams I work with don't want to they don't want to manage their own build farm. They're trying to get away from Jenkins. So they're using GitHub Actions. They're interested in something like a Docker build service or Depot, which was technically doing the same thing. There's depot.dev. You can check them out. They were on the show last year. They already do this. You can already use them to build remotely with the same Docker build commands. They're very similar, rather, Docker build commands that you are used to. If you're using any other, if you're using Azure DevOps or if you're using GitLab or you're using any of these other systems, they all have their own build farms or their own CI farms, which is essentially a build farm. So you would use those tools. In this case, what Docker is doing is they are optimizing for container builds and caching throughout your team to increase the speed of builds way better than maybe your generic CI would. That's really the only difference. Other than that, it produces the same image. It just works. You don't have to manage a Kubernetes cluster just to build your images. And I don't work with teams very often that want to manage their own build farms in Kubernetes because it just sounds like a lot of work and a lot of complexity.
It can get hairy,
Yeah.
to say the least. Next question, I believe.
MD?
Yeah, so MD asks a question regarding DevOps job description. How much do you believe that experience with SMTH, like Jenkins CI, something like would help one get a DevOps role? You kind of answered that question with the answer to your last question. I would say Jenkins is still out there. It's used every day. There's a large install base, I'm assuming. However, it is not where folks are going to if they're doing a greenfield DevOps pipeline tooling. Tools like GitHub Actions, GitLab, Argo CD for continuous deployment with respect to Kubernetes. Things like that are gaining in popularity with respect to current CI/CD practices. Bret, concur? Not concur?
Yep. Not everyone uses Jenkins. So you're asking specifically about a tool and should you learn it? You need to learn it if the company you're trying to apply to uses it. Not everyone uses it. It is on the decline. I think that if you're planning ahead for the future and you know what kind of job you're going for, I would look at if you're just someone who's blasting your resume to every company in the world that will take it, then you can't plan ahead. And the important thing is, like you're saying, you have one CI. If you know one CI well and you know when to use it, how to use it, Jenkins could be one of them. My favorite is GitHub Actions. Those are two very popular options. But if you know one and you know it well, then you're going to be able to use any of the others, and hopefully a job will look at that and realize that you have that experience. But you definitely should have experience with, if you're going to be in DevOps, you definitely need to have experience with a CI. Like, you definitely need to know building,
the pattern,
testing.
Yeah, the pattern is the more important thing there, I think.
Yeah, exactly. The patterns more. That's true of all DevOps, by the way. The patterns of a cloud, of any cloud, are more important than knowing all the clouds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what they're used for.
The patterns of Git and GitHub and Git pull requests and the pull request workflow, those are more important than I know GitLab more than GitHub or whatever particular tool you happen to use. If you don't know GitHub, that's weird. I'm just saying. Like most jobs, even if they don't use GitHub, you will have to use GitHub at some point. If you're, I mean, we're here talking about open source, and open source lives on GitHub. So, if you don't know GitHub, I have run into people where they barely have an account and they barely know anything about it. And I tell them, okay, first off, let's get you invested in GitHub. Has tons of training online. Just search GitHub training or learn GitHub and you'll find official GitHub resources. You want to know that well, because regardless of your job, that's going to probably be part of it. Even if you use GitLab, it's similar to GitHub. So,
I concur 100% with that.
Yeah.
All right.
We have one more question about Docker load balancer real quick. I'm just going to answer that one real quick.
Sure.
I know I'm mispronouncing your name. I'm so sorry. Abzal. The Docker load balancer autoscaling, I think, so there is no such thing as an autoscaling group in Docker. I think maybe what you're talking about is a Docker Swarm service, possibly. Or if you publish, there is a way with just Docker run for you to technically run multiple things under a DNS alias. But if you're talking about load balancers, specifically, that's usually a virtual IP. That's usually in Swarm, and then you ask why we should go through Kubernetes at this situation. But you don't have to use Kubernetes. You can use Swarm. If you can use Docker on a single server to get your job done, that's all you need. Perfect.
Yeah.
If you only need Compose on a single server and it meets your needs and it works for you, don't go Kubernetes. You don't have to go Kubernetes. Not all roads lead to Kubernetes, but many roads lead to Kubernetes. So. Hope that helps. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, a little bit more details on that. So if you have further questions about that, feel free to post in the chat.
Yeah.
I
think the faster we go, by the way, the faster they ask questions. I think that I figured it out.
Should we start using? Should we start using Terraform, or what do you think of OpenTofu? If Terraform works for you, or your whatever problem you're trying to solve, and the company you work for isn't dependent on wrapping Terraform or anything to do with the license change, it depends on how much you want to spin on changing anything that deviates from Terraform to OpenTofu. OpenTofu is super new, so maybe give it a couple beats to shake out and see how the community forms around that. I think it's kind of too early to tell on that, honestly.
Yeah.
Jenkins is great. Spent many a day working on Jenkins. Argo CD is awesome too. Nubo says just learn Terraform for now. Yeah. It should be. Again, back to what we said, the pattern's more important than the tool, right? So getting used to infrastructure as code, getting used to the pattern of codifying your infrastructure changes, putting them into version control, triggering a build, things like that.
The Swarm Charlie, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add to that, Charlie. I'm just a Terraform user, right? I am not in the Terraform team. I am not an open source maintainer of anything Terraform related. And for me, I don't plan on looking at OpenTofu till 2025. I think that the industry needs to figure itself out. The OpenTofu organization or project needs to figure out where its value lies and where it's going to be unique and better or different or whatever. So if you don't know why you need OpenTofu, then I don't think you need OpenTofu yet. You just stick with Terraform. It's fine. The licensing doesn't affect, in my opinion, 99% of people. It is for a small group of people that are making cloud startups and cloud companies, or if you're in specific regulated industries, government industries that have certain policies around licenses you're allowed to use versus not use. If you're one of those, then you will know, and you will probably have to go through all your tools and look for these different types of licenses than the standard Apaches or MITs or that kind of thing. So I think if you're asking that question, I don't think you know that, which means you're sticking with Terraform. Stick with Terraform until you have a good reason, and you'll know that reason when it shows up in your inbox.
This is for you, Bret. How was the Swarm Hangout? I was there too, but I thought it was great.
We had 3 or 4 people. The hallway tracks were small this time just because we didn't have them on the schedule, so people couldn't find them very easily. The schedule was not flushed out. It was essentially a reboot of DockerCon, right? So we're starting over with a new team at Docker running it. They were in a new city this time, and it's been 4 years since we've had another one. It's a whole new team, and it's a new Docker, right? The last time we had a real-world Docker was a different company. They were an enterprise company. And then after the last physical DockerCon, they sold off all their enterprise assets, all their closed source, and like 90% of their people or 80% of their people. Now they've rebuilt back up. I think they're either close or over 500 people now again.
Something like that, yeah.
In 2019, at the end of 2019, they were 73 or something like that.
Yeah.
So they're a whole new company.
Reboot is the right kind of way of thinking of.
SJ laughed when I said that, but yeah, I mean it is. I mean, and some of the old Docker employees that have been there for almost a decade, or some of them actually a decade, and then a lot of those captains that have been around for almost a decade. We were the old guard, and there's all these new people. You and I did see this at DockerCon, constantly seeing people saying, "This is my first DockerCon. We're just now doing containers," and that was happening in the Swarm group. The Swarm fans were people that were new to containers and not seeing the justification in their own workflows and company for Kubernetes, and they were choosing Swarm. So we had some interesting people. One gentleman had 500 replicas on a single node Swarm of a single service, and using Mac VLAN drivers, not the default overlay network driver, and seeing problems, seeing performance issues. Who knew you could even do that? I've never actually seen a 500 replica single node Swarm. So cool. It's actually working. They just had some issues and they were working it out. And luckily we had Nearsighted. Bjorn was there from the Moby team and dropping the knowledge bombs, right? It was just so deep. I couldn't keep up. It was too technical.
It was good. It's always nice to know that there's a community still, and face-to-face a little bit of some of the folks that are looking at, still using Docker Swarm, going into those details. So it was pretty good. We have another question here around, do you have any more context on the 39x faster Mastodon build with cloud builds? Was the comparison with a Pentium 3, I guess, or some processor of some sort? I'm going to say, let's wait. Have the videos of the keynotes been posted already, Bret?
Not that I know of.
So
I mean, that number was marketing, Alex. Like I don't think we're ever going to get real details on that. Or it's kind of like when you look at Apple's keynotes of the line graphs and there's no numbers, and you just see these graphs of 3 times faster or this much faster, and all of the Apple engineers, what do you call them? Not the journalists, but the people on YouTube they're like, I don't know what that means. That means nothing to me. I think that's what this means. Yeah.
We have to wait for more detail on this. And once it's out, you can sign up. There's a link in the newsletter. Let me see if I can find it real quick. There's a form if you want to access early access, and I would say, that link did not paste right. I would say check out, register for early access, and then try it with your hardware. Oh, there you go. And here's the link to the early access program. Docker build. So the best way to figure out what it's going to be like for your hardware is to try it out.
Yeah. If you're running a Mac Studio, like I don't see how this can't be faster. So I don't know what they're using on the back end. Let me just guess. My guess on the back end is they're using pretty beefy servers on AWS. My guess is that they've got Graviton 3 processors in their ARM builds for native, extremely fat with super fast networking, lots of cores. If you're using a Mac Studio with the latest Ultra chip, or it's like the Ultra chip's the one with like 2 chips in one or something, and you've got 64 cores, your ARM build's going to be amazing, but your Intel build is probably going to suck. I know this because I build a Jekyll Ruby, which is Ruby, and that build going through QAMU or emulated builds inside of GitHub Actions or whatever, which runs on Azure, like those builds are wickedly slow compared to the native builds because emulation wickedly slow, wickedly super slow, super duper slow. And so I just know for me and mine, like, I don't see how this can't be faster. Now, 30 times 39x, my guess is they were maybe using something like the Docker desktop defaults, which only, grab like half of your CPUs on your machine. And there's maybe a lot of stuff in Mastodon. I mean, they were saying something like a default Mastodon. Yeah, well, they did say in the keynote. Well, they did give numbers of how long it took to build locally, and it was something like,
but we don't know the
50
configuration
minutes
of the demo. So
we knew that it was 50 minutes, and then it was 2 minutes. That could be because it was building through QEMU emulation. I'm just speculating, but that's as close. I don't think we're ever going to have like, here's the test setup to back up our marketing claim. Just try it. The nice thing is I think it's going to be like a free, like there's going to be some sort of maybe like just like Docker Scout, there's going to be some way you can do like 10 builds a day for free or something. And if you already have a Docker subscription, you might get something. We don't know that yet, but there'll be a way for you to take like your longest build, and you're going to know, if you're in a software team, you know which container you're building that takes the longest. Like everybody knows, right? It's that one that takes 20 minutes or whatever. Because I used to work with a team like that. It was a Ruby system. It was a monolith. It had like 3 different layers of dependencies. Mm-hmm. No matter how we multi-stage that thing, we got it like from 20 down to 7, but we couldn't get it any faster, even with all the caching. And so if you just take that Docker build and swap it, and you just swap your local builder or your CI builder for the Docker Cloud one, and it's faster, then okay, we should try this out. We should try this. This would be easy. Okay, let's go back to this list real quick because I think we can do it. Do you have 5 minutes?
I'll do debug. Okay,
so do debug.
Debug CLI. This was a demo. It's not out yet. So the idea here is, okay, you've got your Docker container running somewhere, and you want to start debugging it, but you're following best practices. You haven't installed everything in the kitchen sink packages on your Docker image. And once you execute into your Docker image, you don't have any of the tools that you need to debug, right? You don't have Vim, you have no ping, you have nothing. And Docker was demoing a tool that's based on Nix OS that allows you to execute those tools from your Docker command line. They execute in your container without changing or modifying your container packages. And that was just, it was a great demo. More information's coming around that. We can take a look at the release. The idea here is to enable better debugging tools. So in the demo, they were changing a HTML file or HTML file inside the container. The container had no Vim, no Emacs, no Nano, nothing, no editor, no text editor. They went back to their command line on their local machine, ran the debug command with Vim, the same command to edit the file. Everything changed, that changed the file, but there was no Vim installed on that container. So that was really neat. So there's some cool magic behind the scenes that they're doing to make that all work seamlessly. The next one was Web GPU. This was a very quick preview. The idea here is that there's no GPU access in the Linux container on Mac OS. And if you're wanting to do machine learning, you want access to your native GPU that's on the host. They set up a web GPU server on your host where your Docker desktop is running, and opened and then I think at runtime they did a library like swap or put the web GPU client library into your container and open a socket between your container to the web GPU server running on the host that enables your container to use the GPU, the native GPU that's on your host, in a transparent manner. So there's a very quick demo. I think there was total maybe 10 minutes on stage. More information coming around that. They didn't really release much around that except for like a quick architecture diagram. I thought it was really neat. And it plays to the next topic, which is the Gen AI stack.
Hold on, stop.
Yeah, no worries.
Wait,
No
sorry.
worries.
You're like me. It's like, let me get a word in. Debug CLI. By the way, these are all vaporware. So debug CLI, we've seen it on stage. We don't have access to it yet. The web GPU, also something we don't have access to yet. We don't know when that's coming. I think the larger potential for that web GPU, though, is the idea that Docker could ship if web GPU is something we can use on every platform, and it can like somehow be bundled with the drivers and all the hardware players get into the game with web GPU. My understanding is it's in browsers, but maybe not on. I don't exactly know how it works under the hood, but like there's a potential there long term for us to have like universal GPU access from containers on every platform. That would be pretty dope. That would be
this was one way to tackle that, and that leads to the next thing, which is the Gen AI stack. So the idea here is that AI ML, creating LLMs, using LLMs, that's an increasingly big use case right now, and Docker has put together what they're calling the Gen AI stack, which is a combination of third-party tools, which are LangChain, Neo4j, and Ollama. Putting that together, there's a repo where you can spin this up on your Docker desktop locally and use that to use LLMs locally, create your new Gen AI applications more easily in a more streamlined manner. We could probably spend a whole entire episode on just this stack, and maybe we should. Let us know in the chat or the comments if that's of interest. But that then leads to the last. I believe this was the last demo that they did on stage, which was Docker Assist, which was a chat bot style or chat AI that was presented through a Jupyter notebook in VS Code that helps you create Docker Compose files, Docker files, run Docker commands. It's kind of an assistant to help you understand how to use Docker and what commands and patterns and best practices to do while you're in like a session in VS Code. I don't know if that's the final state that chat AI bot is going to look like, but the demonstration was in a Jupyter notebook, which I think is probably the quickest way they could show that off. So that rounds out. There was one more announcement, but the Docker Assist was the last kind of demo on stage on the keynote day 2.
Yeah, the Open Pub Key was another. I mean, Docker Assist and I guess the Gen AI stack isn't vaporware. I think because I mean, obviously all those tools exist, right? Like LangChain, Neo4j, Ollama. Yeah. There's already a repo. I am an AI noob from a infrastructure. You know, obviously I'm a GPT user in a lot of tools, but I am a noob when it comes to building up the infrastructure to run my own LLM. Yep. Ollama tries to help with that. And Docker is now, I think, wrapping that with the Neo4j database and like these other pieces of the puzzle, so that you don't even need to install Ollama manually. You can just use Docker's. And I don't know if this is for a fact, but it feels like maybe if it gets a lot of traction, that Docker may actually help add maybe extensions or something in the Docker desktop UI to help people if it's something that people really use a lot locally. The Docker Assist, like you're saying, is just really one way that AI stuff exposes itself. But I don't even see that, other than the fact that these are AI related. I don't really feel like the Docker Assist is related to the Gen AI stack. Like it's two separate things that use AI,
they're separate
right?
things. Yeah. So just to do a quick dive into the Gen AI stack. So Olama is a tool that allows you to run LLMs locally on your local machine. It makes it easier to manage, pull down open source models that exist, and run those models locally. And Neo4j is a vector database for what's called grounding or fine tuning local LLM models or other models that you're running locally to fine tune them to the context and the data that's relevant to your use case. And then LangChain helps you pull and modify and pull these different components together, right? So if you have like a foundational model that you've pulled down, like an open source foundational model, and you want to ground it or change the embedding or fine tune it, you can use LangChain to manipulate the models, to work with those models and create new applications, new Gen AI applications that are what you want. And so these three tools, there might be more in the future, who knows, but these three tools kind of give you a baseline toolkit for working with Gen AI and LLMs locally.
Yeah, that's a way smarter way to say it than I would. It's Docker bundles things in a stack.
Yeah, it's like a pattern, right? It's like an architectural pattern. I think Bret, I would like to ask that our audience and maybe yourself, like we should probably go into a deep dive show on some of these tools in the future, just to kind of, kind of get an idea. Both of us and our audience can learn with us on what these tools do and what they provide and how they can help us.
Feedback is great. I'm asking in chat for it, and we give the people what they want. So I think personally, like Docker Scout and Hydra Build, like those are things I'm already going to be diving into, figuring out because they exist. I think what's nice maybe is that Docker will trickle these things out so that we can actually do this one thing at a time instead of having 8 new things we all got to learn. The last thing here I will say is, before we wrap up these Docker announcements, is the Open Pub Key. It's simply an announcement of the start of a discussion in the industry as a standard that, well, it's at least they're hoping it would be a standard. It's a project now supported by the Linux Foundation or underneath the Linux Foundation, announced by Docker and Bastion Zero. And it's simply a different way of signing images or technically artifacts that is a little bit different than cosign. If you know the SigStore project and you know the cosign tool, those are a popular way today to sign images and artifacts in a Docker registry and to help guarantee that what you intended to run is actually running, or what you intended to build is actually what you're pulling. I put a link in this newsletter to a wonderful dissertation, essentially, from Dan Lork of the SigStore project, breaking down the differences between SigStore and cosign as the tool that you use for SigStore, and this Open Pub Key, which doesn't even have a tool yet because it's so early. They're just trying to come up with ideas. They're two interesting models. They have different dependencies and different pros and cons, is essentially pros and cons. And I think several of the Docker captains, if you've been following the Docker roadmap, if you all out there know that there's a Docker roadmap, you can go into GitHub and ask anything of Docker. Put this in Docker. Make this Docker, please. You can just dump in all your ideas. And just after DockerCon, a lot of the captains have been, and other maintainers have been throwing in the ideas of like, we basically want our images, especially the official images, we want them to be signed by everything, by Notary, by cosign. once OpenPub key comes out, that'll technically be 3 different ways that we can sign three different ways we can sign artifacts. And there's also this whole SBOM thing that we won't talk about today, but this is adjacent to the SBOM thing, and like signing SBOMs, we're delivering SBOM in different format. And so this whole world of security of signing dependencies, artifacts, all that stuff, what is in the artifact, the provenance, that is a series of newsletters I am looking forward to writing. And that's all I'm going to say. These are announcements. We won't even have to care about this till next year.
Yes.
So.
Cool.
All right. Any other questions, people, before we wrap it up? We are running long today.
Yes.
I didn't ask Nirmal about a hard stop.
We have another question here. GitOps does guarantee what we're shipping, how cosign improves that. GitOps does not guarantee anything. If it's not cryptographically, mathematically grounded, then the word guarantee is not a guarantee. I'm just going to put that out there. So the idea here is GitOps provides a way of, so like, for example, you're establishing your Git repo as the source of truth, but there can be changes in the environment, and there's a probability that that's the source of truth, if you will, right? Like there's some drift, and GitOps tooling is trying to account for that drift. But at a given moment, there might be things that happen non-deterministically in your environment. These tools around signing images is a mathematical, cryptographically sound way of saying that the contents of this image hasn't changed since, from whatever you've pulled from that image.
Yeah. It solves 2 different problems. And it's a great question, by the way, SciTech enthusiasts.
Yes.
Argo CD and other GitOps tools, their effort is focused on taking the image tag that you told it to run in the cluster and ensuring that it's the one in the cluster matches the one you've told the cluster to run.
Correct.
Presumably in a Git repo. That tag could be reused. That tag could be replaced by a different image with the same tag of an attacker that has access to your build environment. And that gets us into the whole supply chain security. So what signing is trying to do, it's the same reason it's a very similar reason to 30 years ago, I was SMIME signing my emails, and I thought that was the future of all email, and I wanted to be so cool, and I was GPG, or back then it was PGP, and I was SMIMing two incompatible formats for ensuring that I, the person with the key to the signing encryption, was guaranteeing that the email you received was the exact email I sent, and that I sent it, not someone else pretending to be me. These signing tools for images are the same thing. They are signing at build time, presumably, and then presumably and you can look at these GitOps tools as they are also starting to add signing checkers that will validate the signature before they install it or deploy it to your cluster, thus ensuring that the thing that was built by your official build tools and signed by that workflow, wherever you do that, is the actual thing that GitOps put into the cluster. This is a very basic 30-second description, but that's how
it works together.
It's a great question.
Like the signing of images and GitOps can work really well together, but they're different concerns.
GitOps will run whatever the tag, whatever in that tag, right? Yeah. You make a very specific tag, it'll run that tag regardless of who built it, where they got the stuff they put in that image. Like, it doesn't matter. Signing is one of the many efforts in trying to ensure that what you're running, what you intended in terms of a security, not because GitOps, those tags, like, that's not a security thing, right? It could run anything. It doesn't know what's in there. It doesn't. Yeah, and that's we could talk about this forever. That's actually a great episode. If you're interested more, SciTech, look back on this channel last year for ChainGuard. We had ChainGuard on. They're a company that focuses on supply chain security, and Woofy images, which are a new type of base image that is focused on really good security and also supply chain guarantees and also compatibility. So they are more compatible than Alpine, but less CVEs than all the Docker Hub images I've ever scanned. And they do all this other stuff too. So go look up ChainGuard on this channel and see if you can't find that episode if you're more interested in supply chain security stuff. Yeah. Nirmal, anything else before we go?
We covered a lot. So
as we do.
As we do.
Hey, by the way, thank you so much, Ansa-Q. Martin, I appreciate you. You get the reggae horn. Ansa-Q, I didn't actually post it up here. You gifted a membership to someone else, and that lucky person was Martin. So our regular, which is perfect, our regular, always here almost every week. Martin is just fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. Awesome. You received a free membership from another member that supports this channel. I really appreciate both of you, and thank you very much for supporting us.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Nubo, thanks for your thanks. Thanks everyone else for being here. Next week, we, of course, on Thursdays, YouTube Live every week. Next week, we are back. Next week, I'm looking it up. We have the Veritas team is going to be here talking about net backup for Kubernetes. So if you're someone who's been around IT for a while, decades even, you maybe have heard of net backup. They're one of the oldest and most advanced backup solutions out there for traditional infrastructure. And now they've got a whole new release that is Kubernetes native, and we're going to have them on the show to talk about it. So that's next week, talking about backups. And then after that, course Q&A. And then after that, some more guests, maybe from KubeCon.
Oh, yeah, KubeCon.
Because I think that is, oh, no, actually November 9th is KubeCon. The November 2nd one might be a KubeCon pre-show.
There we go.
Pre-show. What is that going to mean? What are Nirmal and I going to talk about at KubeCon pre-show? And we're also planning to be live again at KubeCon. So
yes,
we'll see what happens there.
Awesome. Can't
well,
wait.
Thank you, Nirmal.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks,
thank you all out there. We'll see you soon.
Bye.